Over the past few years, I've done multiple videos on some of the most popular drivers' rookie seasons. I like to do these deep dives because even though all of them have developed so much as drivers, and also as people since then, like with all of the greats, even as early as their first year, there are always glimpses of something special, and it's very interesting with the benefit of hindsight to see where it all started for the champions and stars of today. However, a few weeks ago I found myself thinking about George Russell's rookie season for Williams in 2019, and how, unlike with the likes of Max and Charles, there is barely even anything written about Russell from 2019. It's one thing judging drivers who are given cars capable of wins in their rookie season, and it's more common to judge drivers who are given cars capable of fighting for points. But how about a rookie season where the driver scored 0 points and in fact got beaten by his teammate in the championship, who himself only managed to score just 1 point? How good was George Russell's pointless rookie season, finishing last in the championship? Now, every season has a bad car. In fact, whether it's the car that finished last or even second to last in the Constructors' Championship, there are always bad teams and bad cars. But it's also worth reiterating that there are levels to bad cars. Although one lap pace is not the ultimate judge of how good a car is because points are scored on a Sunday, it can still be a useful metric. In terms of the 2019 Williams FW42, when it comes to the comparison of the average qualifying gap over the whole season between the car that finished last in the Constructors and the fastest car in that session, in 2022 the FW44 was on average just under 1.4 seconds slower in qualifying. In 2021, with 2 rookies in the car and with the previous generation of cars which perhaps is a little bit more comparable with the 2019 Williams, the Haas VF21 was just under 2 seconds slower on average. However, the Williams FW42 was just over 2.1 seconds slower on average. Apart from sessions when their rivals either had crashes or grid penalties, George Russell and teammate Robert Kubica qualified last on the back row in 90th and 20th in every single race except for one. Although Williams have been a backmarker team for a few years now, 2019 represented the absolute lowest point for this iconic team, both in terms of on-track performance, but also off-track in terms of how much the team was struggling. Even as early as pre-season, the team not only cancelled their shakedown session, but more importantly, failed to run during the first 2 days of pre-season testing at Barcelona. Claire Williams, the team principal, described the morale of the team as the lowest it's ever been. And stepping into that environment as a rookie, where you need to learn quickly knowing that you won't have the car to compete, and then also needing to motivate the team, mentally that is very tough. And now, there have been plenty of rookies that have had to drive backmarker cars, but the difference for most of them is that they go under the radar driving at the back. For George Russell being the reigning Formula 2 champion and also a Mercedes young driver, there was pressure and eyes on him to perform regardless of what the situation at Williams was. Russell came into F1 with a big reputation and quite a lot of hype. At the time, he was one of only 2 drivers to win back-to-back titles in the equivalent Formula 3 and Formula 2 championships, with the other driver being some guy named Charles Leclerc. His Formula 2 championship is particularly legendary because the 2018 F2 grid is considered by many to be arguably the strongest F2 grid ever. In his rookie season, Russell beat the likes of Latifi, De Vries, and fellow 2019 F1 rookies Alex Albon and Lando Norris. In fact, what often gets forgotten is that Russell didn't just beat Lando and Alex in F2, he dominated the 2018 season. I've always thought that it was rather ironic that when you look at the 2019 class of rookies, despite the fact that in F2 they finished with George as the champion, followed by Lando and then Alex, by the end of 2019, in terms of the cars that they were driving in Formula 1, it was Alex who was driving a race-winning Red Bull, Lando who was driving a very strong point-scoring resurgent McLaren, and it was the driver who dominated the other 2 in equal machinery that was given the Williams that was over 2 seconds slower at the back of the grid. Although George hid his frustrations well, and for the most part laughed it off as a defense mechanism, you could see behind his very good PR training that he was frustrated to not be able to compete against the two rookies that he actually beat in the previous year. When judging what a good performance is in cars that are over 2 seconds off the pace, the standings alone won't tell you the full story. So for example, races like Monza, where Russell finished in P14, were actually season highlights because he managed to stay amongst and on the same lap as quicker midfield cars like the Alfa Romeo and Haas. Whilst that might not seem like much, for a car that was often getting lapped twice in one race, just being 1 lap down and amongst the bottom end of the midfield was a significant result. The only comparison we can really make is to Russell's teammate, who in 2019 was the returning Robert Kubica. In qualifying, Russell whitewashed Kubica 21-0, with the average gap being 0.625 seconds. In the races, Russell also had the edge, and out of the 18 races where they both reached the finish, Russell beat Kubica 16-2. Now, I want to add context to those stats. Russell overall was the far quicker driver. His raw pace, especially over 1 lap, which became a lot more infamous in 2021, giving him the name Mr. Saturday, was always there from 2019. In fact, Claire Williams talked about how despite qualifying on the back row of the grid for most of the season, the entire team of mechanics were glued to the screen watching George and just being amazed with what he was able to do. That raw speed in the races allowed Russell to stretch his advantage over Kubica, but there were areas where Kubica was stronger. Especially on race starts, Kubica, due to his racecraft and experience, was actually better at getting the car off the line, and very often he would actually jump Russell and overtake a car or two. However, Russell's superior race pace eventually meant that he was always able to re-overtake his teammate. Russell's performances over Kubica also added to the tension between Kubica and Williams. Right from the beginning, Kubica had the feeling that he wasn't even driving the same car as Russell, because when they were running the same setups, the data, according to him, showed that the car wasn't generating as much downforce. On top of that, Kubica also felt that the team wasn't utilizing his experience and feedback enough to develop the car, and ultimately by the end of the season, when asked what he was looking forward to most, his answer was the flight home. It was a strained relationship, as Kubica felt that the team was a lot more galvanized and centered around George. And on a level, I do think that there was definitely a lot of truth to that. Regardless, it was just another example of how far Williams had fallen by 2019. They had a car that was frustrating and confusing both of their drivers, and then their experienced driver was getting frustrated and confused on top of that with how the team was functioning around him. Despite the understandable tension in the background, Russell and Kubica were actually a really solid lineup given the circumstances. If we compare them to the disastrous lineup at Haas in 2021 of Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin, unlike those two, they actually understood and respected the situation that they were in. When fighting against each other, they were hard but never collided at the cost of the team, and most importantly, they were both very clean drivers. Even though this was before the cost cap, Williams was struggling financially as it was, and so having two drivers who didn't bin it in every other race was arguably the most valuable thing to have, because it allowed them to get lots of mileage, and it also gave them opportunities to take advantage of the other drivers making mistakes. Russell's standout moment in 2019 that really turned a few heads was undoubtedly qualifying at the Hungarian Grand Prix. As mentioned earlier, this was the only race all season where the Williams actually outqualified other cars. The Hungaroring has always been a track where slower cars could actually perform better than their actual level, because there isn't so much reliance on high downforce performance, unlike at tracks like Spa or Silverstone, which would expose the weaknesses of a car like the Williams the most. Around Hungary, if you can get a nice balance around the slower corners, then you can actually hustle a good lap out of a bad car. But it still takes a driver with speed and confidence to push the car to the limit, but not go too far over the limit, because Hungary is also a track that bites. Russell produced one of the laps of the season, qualifying in 16th overall, almost 1.3 seconds quicker than his teammate Kubica, and out-qualifying Perez, Ricciardo, and Stroll in faster cars. Now, granted, neither Perez nor Ricciardo got second laps in Q1 because of traffic problems, but that was the fault of them and their teams, and it doesn't take the shine off Russell's standout lap. In the race, Russell managed to maintain his place coming home in P16 and beating the likes of Stroll in the Racing Point and Giovinazzi in the Alfa Romeo. The chaotic 2019 German Grand Prix was the race where Williams famously scored their only point of the season, but it was still a race of what could have been for Russell. With 20 laps to go, Russell was running ahead of Lance Stroll, who then pitted to gamble on slicks early. And although Russell also wanted to pit, he was denied by the team. Stroll went on to finish in 4th place thanks to that early gamble, and it left Russell frustrated despite arguably having the race of his season up until then. Another frustration for Russell is that in pitting later than his teammate, he also made a mistake in tricky conditions, and it was this decisive moment where Kubica overtook Russell and eventually inherited that final points-paying position. Although Kubica and Russell finished the race in 12th and 13th, after the race, both Alfa Romeos were penalised as their cars were found to have broken race start procedure in running illegal start maps. So just to put all of that into perspective, for Williams to even scrape 1 point, it took one of the most chaotic races in modern history, it took 7 drivers to DNF, and it also took a further 2 drivers to get a post-race 30-second time penalty for Kubica to limp into P10. In the end, Germany wasn't a massive breakthrough, although it must be said, it does stand as a bit of a funny anecdote in Russell's career that, despite dominating his teammate all season, the one race where the team lucks into points, it's Kubica that finished ahead, which means that overall, he beat Russell in the Drivers' Championship. George Russell's rookie season was unfortunately not full of massive highlight performances because he wasn't given the platform to really compete. It was defined more so by the speed Russell showed over one lap, how he showed strength of character to cope with a difficult reality and a very stressful team environment, whilst still doing everything he could do on the track in terms of beating his teammate. It's also important not to overrate Russell's rookie season as well, because at the same time, you can't give Russell massive praise for the results that he didn't manage to get. Of course, the car was the single biggest factor as to why Russell couldn't even fight against the next slowest team. But that's why context and nuance is so important when judging a pointless rookie season in a car as bad as the FW42. The biggest compliment from the journalists that actually saw him for themselves was to compare his pointless 2019 rookie season at Williams to Fernando Alonso's pointless 2001 rookie season at Minardi. Now, that is some serious praise, and despite it taking perhaps a little bit longer to get into a race-winning car, I can't wait to see the pointless rookie of 2019 hopefully fight for world championships very soon.